Great. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jackie Klopp, and I'm the director at the Center for Sustainable Urban Development at Columbia University's Climate School. And I'm really delighted to invite you to this webinar on improving coastal resiliency projects with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Sorry. Let's start with a really big picture, which many of the community members who are in the audience know, is that we really need a lot more protection from flooding. Extreme weather events such as hurricanes, the heavy rain, are increasing with climate change. Just this year, already we've had 11 hurricanes and some pretty nasty ones. Beryl, Debbie, Francine, so forth. And we know that already hundreds of lives have been lost this year and over $1 billion in damage done, probably more. We don't always do the best accounting on that. And something that we don't talk about is that the costs of inaction escalate and will climb if we don't really mobilize to improve how we're doing the protection from flooding. And as you know, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or perhaps as you know, is a central actor in our efforts and the government efforts and efforts with communities to address these very serious flood risks. And they do this through studies and projects under a program called the Coastal Storm Risk Management Program. And a lot of these programs are already going on in some of your communities. There are being studies. Some are farther along. Plans have been approved. And the communities represented in the conversation that we're going to talk about, going to have today, really have, over $150 billion worth of these kinds of programs. So that's a lot of money. We really need to do it right. And these are communities in the East and Gulf Coast. So there's many more of these projects across the country. And one question that we're asking ourselves that I think really needs a lot more attention, and we'll start having that attention through these kinds of conversations, is how well are these projects working to protect communities, and what can we do to improve them? These are very large-scale projects, expensive. We've got to make sure that we're investing properly in protecting communities from floods. So that is the really big picture of why we came together to figure out how these projects are going, what our experiences are in different communities, and really put our minds together with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other key actors on how to improve how they work. And so the work that our center with the Resilient Coastal Communities Project in New York, New Jersey area was doing started to lead us to reach out to other communities in Charleston and Galveston and Miami, Norfolk, and some others. And we started to realize there's a huge value in us having these conversations. And one thing we found is we found very similar challenges, which suggests some very serious, sort of more structural problems that need to be dealt with. And so out of these conversations, we developed a policy brief detailing some of the recommendations coming out of the wisdom of the people you're going to hear next. And, their long-term engagement with U.S. Army Corps projects and coastal and flood resiliency. So you are able to take a look at those policy briefs. We have them in English and in Spanish, and you have the QR code for the English on top and the QR code for the Spanish on the bottom. And so with that, I am going to really turn this conversation over to Rachel Rohde, who is the manager of the Climate Resilient Coasts and Watersheds for the Environmental Defense Fund, to take us from here. Rachel, it's all yours.
Thanks, Jackie. Like Jackie said, I'm going to be the moderator today. Really excited to have you all here. My name is Rachel Rohde. I'm with EDF. I am actually based in St. Petersburg, Florida, so have very familiar with the recent hurricanes. And so this conversation is more timely than ever. But before I jump in, I do want to first acknowledge, and you'll hear this from all of our speakers, I want to acknowledge the land that I inhabit, which, like I said, is St. Petersburg, Florida, is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tocobaga people. And I also want to recognize the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes whose ancestors survived colonization and removal and who continue to thrive and contribute to the stewardship of Florida's lands and waters. I want to honor the enduring connection the indigenous peoples have to this land and the Gulf waters, and I commit to respecting their ongoing relationship with this place. So let this just be an acknowledgement to all of us to serve as a reminder to reflect on our shared history, supporting indigenous sovereignty, and advocating for environmental justice in partnership with Native communities. With that being said, I am now going to turn it over to our first speaker, Robert Rosso. Robert is a research assistant at Columbia University's Center for Urban Sustainability Development's Resilient Coastal Communities Project. He is a recent graduate of Columbia University's Master of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy program with experience in local advocacy, operational sustainability, and policy work. During this past year, he's focused his research with RCCP on developing more equitable climate resilience projects and led an initiative to bring together experts to publish a policy brief, which you'll hear about today, on improving the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers mega projects. So Robert, it is all you.
Hi, I'm Robert, and just before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge that in New York City, we're on historical Lenape land. But if you can go to the next slide. So I'm going to first talk about the Coastal Resiliency Project in New York City, which is the New York, New Jersey, and Harbor and Tributary Study. It is one of the largest of the federal government's studies, and is a proposal to mitigate flood damage through building a network of storm surge barriers, seawalls, sea gates, and other flood mitigation measures. It spans over 900 miles of coastline, and the estimated cost right now is going to be $52 billion. So again, yeah, it's one of the largest and most complex of its kind, and will take potentially decades to finalize and construct. The Resilient Coastal Communities Project is a partnership with the Columbia Climate School and the New York Environmental Justice Alliance, and we have been working to advocate for reforming the HATS project for become a more truly community-led resilience plan. And we've been working alongside roughly 24 other community organizations to engage with the Army Corps on planning for the HATS project since 2022. And throughout this process, community groups have expressed frustration in how they're engaged by the U.S. Army Corps and how seriously the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers takes into account the concerns and comments about the proposal, which have been made by over 2,600 residents, dozens of community organizations, and countless elected officials. So yes, there are some concerns about HATS. The project process has raised concerns and about the current approach to resilience planning by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. One of the criticisms of the proposal is that it prioritizes storm surge flooding and does not accurately account for other types of flooding, such as heavy rain-driven flooding. Heavy rain-driven flooding, which is responsible for much of the harm and damage during Hurricane Ida. These projects further do not take into account the level of sea level rise that is expected over time and already affects flooding in areas with high water tables and sunny days. The proposal further does not center frontline and disadvantaged communities that are most vulnerable to flooding and need to have room for input on planning processes that affect their communities. The proposal also underutilizes natural nature-based solutions that work with nature and are particularly effective in addressing risk from multiple sources of flooding. The U.S. Army Corps has continued this approach without addressing many of these community concerns, as it's not meaningfully engaged the community to leverage their knowledge during the process. HATS was paused in 2019 and reworked, and the study received more funding in 2020. But despite this, we're still seeing some issues. I think you might have missed a slide. Yeah, so there have been some steps in the right direction. Some policies attempted to address this. First was Section 8106 of the Water Resources and Development Act, which allows for the study of multiple sources of flooding to be considered instead of just storm surge. The first and only request to do this was the Corps plan, was on the Corps plan on the HAT study, which was invoked by the states of New York and New Jersey. To address issues of environmental justice, HATS is the first study that the Army Corps of Engineers has committed to an Environmental Justice Coordinating Committee, or EJCC, which will be the first of its kind towards centering the communities that are most vulnerable to flood risk. There is additionally a proposed rule by the U.S. Army Corps to change decision-making to equally consider social, environmental, and economic variables rather than just prioritizing economic variables, which has resulted in bias for more expensive flood mitigation measures in more expensive property areas. The next slide. But the status of these initiatives is not clear. A year after Section 8106, there is no shared public plan on how to incorporate this analysis into the study, despite the fundamental risk analysis changing as new flooding types are now included in the study. A fresh look is needed by the Army Corps to ensure that this is carried out correctly. The Environmental Justice Coordinating Committee is further facing challenges as the Corps is no longer able to host this committee themselves. We at RCCP have been working closely with the Corps to hold them to their commitment on this, along with many other groups, and have co-produced the draft committee's charter with the Army Corps. And there's hope that dialogue with New York City and the U.S. Army Corps will continue and allow the committee to eventually meet. The rule to consider environmental, social, and economic variables is also without implementation, and it's unclear how this will be carried out. And now HATS is currently paused, and it needs more funding to pick up the study where it left off. Our organization, along with many others, has been in support of the New York Army Corps' district receiving $14 million in funding that is needed to restart the study. So a few key takeaways from this. The first is the HAT study is one of the largest and most complex undertakings the Corps has done, and given its potential for protection, it needs to have funding continued while addressing the community concerns that have contributed to it being held up. Frontline communities that are most vulnerable to flooding need to be centered in this process, and having a formal role in the Environmental Justice Coordinating Committee would be the first step in producing more equitable outcomes, and this committee needs to start meeting. We need to work with nature when designing resilience plans, and it is what communities want and is effective in mitigating flood risk. And lastly, with early and meaningful engagement on these issues, project plans like HATS can avoid costly delays and ultimately result in better protection for their communities. Great, and I'll pass it off to Rachel.
Thanks, Robert. And I did want to mention, I put it in the chat, but just in case, we are going to be doing the Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, something pops up in your mind, please put it in the chat, or even better, use the Q&A feature. We'll be able to see it a lot quicker and address it after all the presentations. So moving on to our next presenter, Skip Stiles. Skip is Senior Advisor and former Executive Director of Wetlands Watch, a statewide nonprofit environmental group based in Norfolk, Virginia. In this position, he has been involved in sea level rise adaptation work at the community level for over 18 years. Prior to his current position, starting in 1998, Mr. Stiles was an independent consultant providing editorial and public policy services to a number of clients on issues related to science, the environment, and public policy. A partial list of his clients include the White House Office of Science Policy, the Rockefeller Foundation, Pew Charitable Trusts, RAND Corporation, and the National Academy of Sciences. Before that, Skip served in a variety of senior staff positions during 22 years in the U.S. House of Representatives. He was Chief of Staff for Congressman George E. Brown Jr. of California, Staff Director of the House Agriculture Research and Environment Subcommittee, and Legislative Director for the House Science Committee. He is author of a number of publications on sea level rise and adaptation, and has served on the Virginia Climate Change Commission in 2008. And he is also a recipient of the Urkel Environmental Leadership Award, currently residing in Norfolk, Virginia, and he is a graduate of the College of William and Mary. So I will turn it over to Skip.
Thank you. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge the shared heritage of our land and water here in Norfolk with the Chesapeake people and today's tribes, the Nansemond, Pamunkey, Mattaponi, Chickahominy, and Nottoway tribes. So I want to give you an overview of Norfolk's project. We were the first project to go through the process and were the guinea pig for a lot of the policies and programs that now are being modified. So if you'll flip it to the next slide. So this is, to give you a brief overview, this is the process through which these programs and all of the core programs go, where there's a reconnaissance study. Is this something we want to do? There's a feasibility study. Can we do it? What's it going to cost? What's the environmental impact? And then you move to the pre-construction engineering and design phase that brings it to basically to a pre-permit level of detail. The construction phase, well, the project partnership agreement, which is the contract between the Corps and the non-federal partners, the construction phase, and then when you're finished with that, the Corps turns it over to the non-federal partner, the locality, and then you're in the O&M or operation and maintenance phase. So our process began way back in 2012. The reconnaissance study was done. We had a feasibility study that was released in 2017 and approved by our city council in 2018. We then moved to the design phase of this, which was truncated by the fact that we got money for part of the project in 2022, thanks to Senator Warner. And this required us to move to the construction phase and to sign a project partnership agreement with the Corps of Engineers. So that's the way we've moved through the process. And give me the next slide and click it a couple times. So this project started out at 1.8 billion, it's now up to 2.6 billion. All of these projects will inflate tremendously because of the amount of construction that's going on nationally, thanks to the infrastructure package. So cost of these projects is a concern. It's outside of the policy paper, but it's something we definitely need to keep our eye on. So if you move ahead, in this process, there are two key points that I think everybody involved in these has to be aware of. The feasibility study is also the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act determination, the finding of is there significant environmental impact or not. And with the approval of the feasibility study, you move out of that phase. So the critical point for the environmental considerations is at the approval or the consideration of the feasibility study early on in the process. The next big road bump, the next big threshold is before the construction phase, you have to sign a project partnership agreement. This locks the design and the cost in. And this is significant because any change after this point is what the Corps calls a betterment and will probably be on the local and state partners to pay for completely. It's sort of like if you're redoing your kitchen, you sign a contract with a contractor, any changes you want to make after that, you're going to pay double for. So to use the analogy, that's what's going on. These are the two key points in this process. The next slide. So in Norfolk, what we've got is essentially a flood wall around most of the city. The crosshatched areas in here are non-structural solutions where the benefit cost analysis did not justify an outward barrier. And so we're in these neighborhoods, they're talking about filling in basements and lifting houses. The one big blank spot on this map, the Norfolk Naval Base, at the time of our study, they did not include adjacent military facilities in the study. Subsequently, that's been changed, but we've got a big hole in the northwest portion of our city where there is not a portion of this project. It's sort of on the Navy to help us out at some point in the future. Give me the next slide. So at the same time, I want to mention that we, the Corps of Engineers accelerated their process for feasibility studies, and it was codified by Congress in a 3x3x3 process. That's what it's called. Essentially, the feasibility study process is supposed to take 3 years, cost $3 million, and at the end of it, it goes all the way through the 3 layers of government, all the way up to the Office of Management and Budget. Many of the problems that we had in Norfolk are due to the fact that due to this accelerated process. Some of them are caused by outdated core problems that are in the policy brief. One of the big problems was our environmental assessment found no significant environmental impacts, despite the fact that the water quality work was not complete. This is what led Wetlands Watch to oppose, and we still oppose, this study, this project, because the water quality work has not been done. Click ahead one. There also was no environmental mitigation plan. Mitigation cost estimates were not presented, so we don't know what the offsets are going to cost for the environmental damage that this project will cause. The outreach was inadequate. There was only one public meeting in a city of 230,000 people to review a feasibility study on what is the largest public works project in the city's history, $2.6 billion. Because of the accelerated process, this was a problem. And then, as I mentioned, we used a current benefit cost analysis that led those crosshatch neighborhoods with inadequate protection. If you move ahead. As others will tell you, the nuisance flooding, rainfall flooding, chronic sea level rise, and hybrid flooding were not addressed. This is not the Corps' fault. They were told by Congress only to deal with storm surge. And so this is a big problem. To fix the other flood needs would cost Norfolk about $2 billion in additional costs. And just as a matter of reference, this year in Norfolk, we've had 94 days where water has reached a flood stage. We had 19 days in a row where water reached a flood stage in September and October. So these chronic flooding issues are a major issue in Norfolk. Click ahead. Where rainfall impacts were used to assess the size of pumps, they did not use the current state estimates. Our state engaged in a study to look at the increased rainfall since the last rainfall estimates were made in 2006 and found an 18% increase in rainfall intensity, duration, and frequency on average. These were not included in the study. The project uses, and all of these projects use, the wrong rate of relative sea level rise. They use the U.S. Army Corps Intermediate level. The rest of the state and all of the localities in this region use the NOAA Intermediate high level of projections for sea level rise. At the outer years of this project, that means that the water will be 1.5 feet higher than the Corps of Engineers estimates. And click ahead. And also natural and nature-based solutions were not included anywhere in the study except for adjacent to some of the gray infrastructure. We attempted to get them to use more natural and nature-based solutions, but they were not included. Click ahead. So the Corps said when we protested many of these issues that the unresolved issues would be addressed during the pre-construction and engineering phase. However, none of these issues were resolved because the city moved quickly into, or rather rapidly, into the project partnership agreement to build the first sections of the project. So this is a big problem. There are many unresolved issues because of the speed with which this project moved through. It also signed the PPA before Section 8106 was enacted, which means that other CSRM localities can appeal using Section 8106 to have these other flood impacts included. Norfolk cannot, nor can Charleston, which has moved through the environmental assessment process. The neighborhoods and business community in Norfolk are now just discovering the project alignment, again, because of the inadequate outreach. Developers finding that the flood wall leaves them outside of the protection, things like that. They're trying to get changes in the alignments, but again, because we've already signed the partnership agreement, the changes are a betterment and will cost the city and the state 100% of the additional cost. So the benefit cost analysis was a big problem here. The way this has been done in the past is the benefit is determined by the flood loss avoided, which is pegged to the value of the property. And the cost has to at least equal the flood loss avoided. So if you're in a neighborhood of $100,000 homes, that sort of maxes out how much of a project you can get. If you're in a neighborhood with $5 million homes, you can get a whole lot better flood protection. And in the map here, the circled portions are low-income neighborhood in Berkeley and Compostela. They were left out of protections. They protested, and the city of Norfolk is now seeking an additional authorization just for those neighborhoods. They're using the newer benefit cost analysis that Robert talked about, and we're hoping that that will withstand any changes that may be taking place after January at the federal level. So lessons to wrap up, we need more time and funding than is used in 3x3x3 process. Most of the other CSRM projects are actually running longer than the 3x3x3 process, and that's the way they should be done. All of these projects should go to a full environmental impact statement and not have a simple finding of no environmental impact like ours did. Congress needs to change and broaden the authorization even beyond the optional use of Section 8106 to include all of the other flooding that takes place. The estimates of relative sea level rise need to be more realistic. The inadequate outreach is a big problem. We're seeing a lot of resistance in Norfolk as people become aware of the fact that they're outside the wall or that the 10-foot high walls are going right down the middle of their streets. And finally, we're having in Norfolk to reevaluate how the low-income neighborhood solutions are fashioned. Again, hoping that the federal government will change the way that the benefit cost analysis is done. And with that, I'm done.
Thanks, Skip. All right, we'll move on to our next presenter, Joni Steinhaus. Joni has worked in formal education and environmental sites, including the Houston Zoo, the Lower Colorado River Authority, and Turtle Island Restoration Network. She has extensive experience in the education of youth and adults about stewardship and conservation of our natural resources. Joni has worked with a variety of organizations, both locally and statewide, to advance conservation and sustainability issues. Her diverse knowledge and passion about the environment in the Texas area has shown in her outreach work to local politicians, community groups, homeowner associations, and the general public to help them understand the value of protecting the local flora and fauna. Joni currently serves as a sanctuary advisory member for the Flower Gardens Bank National Marine Sanctuary in a conservation seat. So I will turn it over to you, Joni.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Karankawa land, also known as Galveston, Texas. If you could go back one, Jackie, real quick. Just want to explain, actually, there we go, perfect. The Surge Forward is a coalition of local and regional organizations in the Houston-Galveston area, and we are committed to advocating for better solutions and alternative to our project, which was first known as the Ike Dike, or the coastal barrier system proposed by the Corps. We focus on promoting alternative approaches to coastal resilience, nature-based solutions, and addressing the needs of communities, and bringing this conversation to the people to ensure that they stay informed. Next slide, please. This image shows the hurricanes that have hit Texas since 1842, for a total of 64 storms total impacting Texas. Next, please. Hurricane Harvey had rainfall totals that were unprecedented. Some areas received over 50 inches of rain. In July, the Texas coast was hit by Hurricane Beryl. This was a Cat 1 storm, and we did have flooding, but the major damage was due to wind. And just as you've heard from the other presentations, the projects that are proposed for the upper Texas coast don't address these major rain events or wind. Next, please. We have huge industrial complexes in the Galveston and Houston Ship Channel, and flooding of these complexes releases toxic chemicals, making flooding even more dangerous. The floodwaters are entering homes, and individuals are wading through these chemicals as they're trying to escape, and our first responders are working. Next slide, please. In this area of the Houston Ship Channel, there are over 160 complexes that could be impacted by storm surge. To address this concern in a faster timeline, we must focus on identifying facilities that pose a significant risk to our communities, enforce and improve facility standards, and require that industry invest in protection and not place this financial burden on our communities. Next slide, please. Hurricane Ike hit the Texas coast in 2008, that is 16 years ago. And since that time, Texas A&M Galveston introduced the concept of the Ike Dike. And this image represents the Corps' current design of this portion of the coastal barrier system. On the upper Texas coast, there is both bay and gulf hard structures. There is no set date for construction to start. Even though there are numerous hard structures in the project, there are communities that will be left out and not protected from the storm surge.
The current projected cost for this project is $57 billion. And the Corps has stated that the design of the project is a minimum of another 7 years out. Next slide, please. The largest component of the gate system, which goes across Bolivar Roads, which is the area that connects Galveston Island to Bolivar Peninsula, extends over 2 miles, and nothing like this has ever been constructed anywhere in the world. The current gate system is less than 30% complete, and it would require the deepening of our ship channel another 60 feet. These gates would change the flow pattern in and out of the bay. They would change the velocity. The salinity and turbulence would be created near these hard structures. And of course, the environmental impacts cannot be fully analyzed. Next slide, please. On either side of, these are the main sector gates, and pilots associations in Galveston and Houston have raised concerns that these gates would not be navigable by the large vessels that enter our ship channel. The concern, of course, they're going to be closed during a storm. Will the computers fail? Will they be able to open back up? Will the water that's trapped in the bay system be able to be let go and back out into the Gulf of Mexico? What happens when we lose power or generators fail? There's going to be a ton of sediment and debris that's washed up against them, and this is going to impact the ability to function. The next slide, please. On either side of the sector gates are vertical lift gates, basically guillotine doors. And again, the same concerns. Sediment will build up behind these gates. Will they open properly? Will computers fail? It is impossible right now to predict the annual maintenance and maintenance cost, but the Corps currently estimates that annual operation and maintenance will be over $100 million. Next slide, please. There's also proposed enormous double lines of dune systems, and this would stretch over 43 miles on Galveston and Bolivar. This is not realistic or sustainable for the Upper Texas coast. You would need a minimum of a football field in front of the existing beach to ensure that the dunes are not washed away. We don't have enough sand. They haven't fully identified a sand source, and so now they've already begun research on a hardcore center. And again, this is a structure that wouldn't be built for 15 to 20 years. And we on the Upper Texas coast are experiencing extremely high rates of erosion, anywhere from 3 feet to 8 feet annually. Next slide, please. The last component of the system proposed for the Upper Texas coast is a ring barrier around Galveston Island. It would be a system of walls, gates, pump stations, and levees, and surround about 15.8 square miles of the city. The maximum height of this flood wall is currently proposed at 14 foot, and Hurricane Ike hit us at 15 to 18 feet in a storm surge. There would be numerous gates across the front of the seawall and railways that cross it, and also in the left-hand side, you see the image that's off its bayou. They would need to put an additional gate system there. And of course, creating this ring barrier would allow the water to be trapped. So there has to be additional drainage structures and pumping systems to remove this excess water. Next slide, please. So the key concerns that the Storage Forward group has raised, we want to involve the community. We've been doing continued outreach for the last 12 years. And they have brought Dutch people, the Dutch Infrastructure and Water Management Agency, attended meetings in the Galveston area, and they spoke about their structures, and they told us things will happen to these structures. There will be unplanned, unbudgeted, dangerous repairs and modifications that are needed that are extremely expensive to fix. And it's not if, but when the gates are hit by vessels. Their structures have experienced ship strikes and costly maintenance and testing operations, which shut down the shipping operation. They have devastating environmental effects on their bays and estuaries. And again, the environmental impacts of our system that is proposed are not fully studied or known, and because they're doing it in a tiered NEPA project. We also raise concerns about environmental justice. There are communities that are not going to be protected by this storm surge. And again, industry should ensure that the structures and their facilities are built to withstand the storm surge and not put this financial burden on the communities. Next slide, please. What we will work to do and continue to do is listen to the impacted communities, center their experiences, and this includes inner-centered communities that are not, that experience flooding from this storm. It's not just coastal communities. We will continue to push for non-structural protection, beach nourishment that is at a scale that's reasonable and doesn't deplete our sand, restoring our wetlands and our oyster reefs that reduce the wave energy and erosion. Look at flood-proofing the existing buildings and stop building in floodplains and on the coastline. Work with nature and move people out of harm's way. The plan should include smaller scale projects, which it does, that are more affordable and far less negative impact on the environment and people. We need to address the root cause of climate change and work towards a broad climate action plan. Again, this proposed structure would not begin for 15 years, and the current budget is $57 billion. What will that figure be in 2040, 2044? What could we have accomplished in the last 16 years since Hurricane Ike? And what could we accomplish in the next 10 to 15 years investing in green infrastructure? Thank you so much. I'll pass it back to Rachel.
Thanks, Joni. All right, we're going to move on to the last speaker, but certainly not the least, Audrey Sue at Miami Waterkeeper. Audrey is the policy director for Miami Waterkeeper, which is a South Florida nonprofit dedicated to advocating for resilient solutions grounded in science, rooted in nature, and driven by community. She brings experience across government, nonprofit, and private industry sectors. Her professional career began with the Army Corps of Engineers as a regulatory specialist, where she executed on major federal acts, including the Clean Water and National Environmental Policy Acts, working with project proponents to avoid and minimize resources in the public trust. She has also worked as an environmental consultant on projects for private development and public works, leading contamination due diligence, environmental impact mitigation, and helping clients navigate complex regulatory environments. Audrey translates her government and private sector experience to her advocacy work at Miami Waterkeeper. Advocating for watershed-wide improvements and resilience involves an intersection of issues, including funding heavy civil infrastructure, incorporating nature-based solutions into urban areas, creating meaningful and enforceable policy changes, and instigating broad public involvement and buy-in for resilient and equitable solutions. So Audrey, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone. I would first like to acknowledge that Miami Waterkeeper works throughout lands originally cared for by the Seminole, Miccosukee, and Tequesta people. I thank them for their care of this land, and I also acknowledge the destruction from urbanization that has occurred here. So I am the policy director with Miami Waterkeeper. This first slide shows a dramatically flooded downtown Brickell in Miami in 2017 after Hurricane Irma. Flooding, we of course expect to happen more frequently. I have a policy talk prepared today on the Miami-Dade CSRM project to address this more severe storm surge. But before I get into this policy talk, I want to ground the presentation in the context of where I live and work, because the implementation of policy is all about context. Next slide, please. So what do people think about when they think about Miami? You probably tend to think of water, our beach, our bay, the Everglades, sun, and tourism. We have some of the most expensive zip codes in the US, with lots of communities built along and near the waterways, where our waters serve as aesthetic and economic powerhouses for the region. But the proximity to waterways also subjects the community to increased coastal storm surge risks, especially since down here in the South, we're right in Hurricane Alley. We are a major economy with a shipping and cruise port, and we're a gateway to Latin America and beyond. We attract lots of cultural diversity. There are a plethora of languages spoken here. And there are many folks that come to Miami seeking a chance at a better life. And one other context consideration I'd offer is that Miami was also once the Deep South, and today we still grapple with historic inequities. So even though we have some of the most expensive real estate in the country, there's a stark gap between wealthy and poor, with about 19% of our population that lives below the poverty line. Next slide, please. I also want to talk about our ecosystems because they act as natural infrastructure in South Florida, and they impart multiple benefits to our stakeholders. We've unfortunately destroyed much of them, but the thing is, these ecosystems prop up our economies of fisheries and our tourism economy, and they create a sense of place that is Miami. And they're also adapted for major storms. The red mangroves and coral reefs shown in the left and right photos, they possess a high degree of surface area, and that creates friction and drags on waves, slowing them down. Next slide, please. So in the slide, you can see that we have multiple speed bumps or multiple lines of defense from east to west. Our reefs, our sand dunes covered in sea oats, mangroves, seagrasses, and freshwater wetlands, all of these slowing down storm surge or acting as reservoirs to capture water. And I like to say that Mother Nature is the most accomplished engineer you'll ever know because she's had lots of time and space to experiment and refine. And this is what's happened in South Florida is our natural ecosystems over millennia are adapted and resilient to shocks and stressors from major storms. Next slide, please. So one last consideration is geologic. We lie in this highly porous lime rock substrate, and it transmits water rapidly. If you cut a cross section of it, it looks like Swiss cheese. Whatever water is doing on the surface of the land, it's doing just that beneath our feet. So when storm surge rushes over the land, it's also moving underneath it. In South Florida, during a hurricane, this means that groundwater surges to the surface, combining with rain and storm surge for a flood more dangerous than each driver alone, hence compound flooding. So what I'm getting at in this presentation before I go into the policy is that any storm surge solutions need to be tailored for our unique geology and landscape and society. The process by which we go about it needs to engage our diverse community with all the different languages spoken here. And the solutions inherently need to be equitable and not just protect the wealthy. Next slide, please. In 2019, and here we are in downtown Miami, the Corps came to town under its 1955 mandate to work on the Miami-Dade Back-Bay Study, CSRM. They followed NEPA processes, they solicited community input, and people welcomed the Corps to work on this existential problem that we face. Folks commented that they wanted to see natural and nature-based features. They wanted protection of vulnerable communities, and they wanted compound flooding addressed. Next slide, please. And here's what we got. We got a very large wall, 20 feet high in some places, running along downtown Miami. Despite the community participation, the Corps didn't truly integrate what the community voiced. The Corps, of course, proposed this huge wall. They used property values to guide where to provide protection. This effectively perpetuated inequity by protecting those wealthy zip codes and leaving some vulnerable communities out. They didn't address compound flooding. And as a result, the Corps was subject to widespread community outrage, which they were not prepared for, from developers whose properties would lose value to environmentalists and academics concerned about water quality and habitat impacts. People who were not traditionally allies came out united against this proposal. In 2021, Miami-Dade's mayor convinced the Assistant Secretary of the Army to halt the study for a year so that other options could be explored. And we've since gone through a year-long do-over period to source a locally driven plan. Next slide, please. Miami Waterkeeper has been participating in this do-over process. We formed a coalition of advocates, which includes my mentor, Rachel Rohde, to participate in this process and fix fundamental challenges. We're encouraging the Corps to include ecosystem values and social equity in its cost-benefit analysis. And we're pushing the Corps to come up with novel solutions and procedures because more gray infrastructure like a wall for so many reasons is not going to work for us in Miami. And of course, we've also pushed for compound flooding analysis. Next slide, please. To the Corps' credit, they did start listening. They set up a web-based GIS-powered tool to solicit community input. They worked with the county to put together a year of meetings, charrettes, and webinars. And I think we're starting to make some progress in the right direction. We've recently gotten a new chief's report with a recommended plan forward. And this plan includes no walls, but non-structural features, elevating residences. And this is a voluntary program for homeowners. There's also proposal for flood-proofing businesses and critical infrastructure. Most significantly, this plan for non-structural features is NED exempted. And what is NED? It stands for National Economic Development. This is the Corps' process for economic analysis. NED calculates the net economic benefits of a project by summing up the positive economic impacts and subtracting the negative impacts associated with each alternative of the plan. It looks for the most economically optimal option. This is done in a standardized framework that applies to the entire nation. But as I've said earlier, Miami is unique, and standardized economic frameworks aren't going to capture the important local costs and benefits. And by this, I really mean social and environmental considerations, because those social and environmental considerations also really define the character of our city. So our project has been NED exempted with the intent to maximize public benefits, including social cohesion and reduction of life loss in EJ communities. In addition to the recommended non-structural plan, the Corps is proposing a natural and nature-based solutions pilot program to the tune of $180 million. They are also proposing a programmatic non-structural study authority. This is a $6 million program to study non-structural measures that the Corps currently has limited experience with. These include apartments, complex critical infrastructure, like hospitals. So these are currently out of the comfort zone of the Corps, and the Corps is promising to do the work to get comfortable with them. There's still key areas for the Corps to address, similar to what the other panelists have stated. We are still looking for multiple flood hazards, that compound flooding, to be addressed. We want the Corps to comprehensively evaluate benefits, including social and environmental. We want the Corps to prioritize frontline communities through transparent public engagement. And we think they should provide outreach and materials in Spanish and Creole. And we want the Corps to strengthen the proposed non-structural program to create working groups, because elevating thousands of homes is a big deal. We've recommended that they involve people not just at NEPA waypoints, but all along the project progression. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. So what my last slide shows is that landscape level restoration of ecosystems can damper storm surge, such that flood walls can be fewer and shorter. It represents a paradigm shift from the Corps' current thinking that we want the Corps to adopt. The Corps is a wonderful organization filled with good people, and like any big organization, it lurches forward on inertia. Getting new policies and procedures, following new paradigms is like turning a battleship. And this is the work that advocacy groups do. The presenters today are trying to turn that battleship. And we want to show that when the Corps gets out of the silo, and when we're invited to the table, we can work out something. The solutions may be unconventional, but that's a good thing, because the problems that we face are unprecedented. I don't know anywhere else in the nation where the Corps has done a study where they've gone with an NED exemption, an NNBS pilot program, and a comprehensive urban non-structural study program to address what it doesn't know. So final words before I turn it back over to Rachel. These CSRM projects are critically important, and depending on how they're built and designed, for better or for worse, they will shape the face of our communities. What we're trying to prove in Miami is just what Rachel said in the beginning. Coming together is key to improving resiliency and key to improving the outcomes of these major projects. And back over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Audrey. And thanks to all of our presenters. We have traveled up and down the coast. So I do want to leave enough time so we can do some Q&A. Also, yes, thank you, Jackie. If you want to reach out to any specific presenters or myself or Jackie, our information is on here. Happy to do any follow-up questions and answer those as well. So I'm going to jump. We've got a few questions, it looks like, in Q&A. And the first one from Patrick. I don't know if this is for you, Robert. I know it was put in the beginning, but I'll kind of open it to everyone. Does the resiliency project also consider remediation strategies? For example, dealing with contaminated soils from industrial and military waste. Seems a lingering growing problem as groundwater rises and runoff erosion increases during floods. So have any of the studies that you all are engaged in, specifically coastal storm risk management studies, do they have any consideration towards remediation?
I can jump in a little bit. Remediation, at least in our region, seems to be a potential barrier to doing coastal resiliency projects. So sometimes they're delayed until sort of remediation or contamination is addressed. So I'm not aware that they're actually integrated into the resiliency work, and in fact can delay it. But it's so important. And some of these natural nature-based solutions also might be able to help with remediation. So we might be able to do some of those, at the same time. And that's an advantage of these kinds of approaches as well. So that's just some thought, and it's not, this is impressionistic from the conversations I've heard.
Any others have thoughts?
I'd like to add that when they dredge, they do some soil samples, especially in the ship channel, but they might not be current, and there might be, accidents or fires from industry and chemicals that are released into the ship channel that settle in these soils. And so I have done FOIAs when they used to take it, when they did the Houston ship channel, they would take it offshore and dump the spoils. Now they're calling it beneficial dredge, and they're placing it on our beaches for nourishment. But when you look at the samples, there's pages and pages of chemicals in these soils in the ship channels. It's impossible not to be with the industry and the vessels that are going in and out. And so I don't know if it's exactly a response to it, but that is something that the Corps is doing. And we know these soils have contaminants, the dredge materials have contaminants, and they're placing them on our public beaches.
Well, while I have you, Joni, I think these are directed to you, these next couple of questions. So Ken, a little bit about the Houston-Galveston area. What role does the Houston ship channel play in storm surge propagation? The HSC is constantly being enlarged with no end in sight. Because of the very shallow waters of the Galveston Bay, the HSC represents a deep slot in a very shallow estuary, suggesting it may play a critical role in propagation of storm surge. If this is the case, we may literally be causing the problem ourselves, in addition to climate change, and we have not stopped exacerbating the problem.
Absolutely. So thank you. So initially there was another project. If you're not familiar, the Gulf of Mexico, Galveston Bay, the Houston ship channel goes from the northwest part of Galveston Bay. And so initially there was a Centennial Gate that was proposed. The giant projects that's proposed by the Corps is being presented as a need for national security because of the numerous refineries that we have along the ship channel. And so they are saying that they need to stop the storm surge from the bay going up into the Houston ship channel. And so, yes, this channel is constantly dredged. It's on an 18-month cycle. We are making the problem worse. And as I said in my presentation, we're not putting the responsibility for storm surge on the industry themselves, their complexes. We're going to put the burden of fortifying these complexes by building this giant gate system, 2-mile gate system, on 5 communities that basically can't afford additional taxes for maintenance and operation.
Thanks, Joni. We have a question here that I think is one for everyone to chime in on. This question is for whoever. So where does the responsibility for lack of enough outreach or insufficient study fall? Does it fall on the local sponsor or the Corps or both?
This is Skip. I sort of typed in and answered that in advance, but my feeling is because we have had inadequate outreach, the responsibility really falls on the non-federal partner. The Corps of Engineers is not in the business of doing a lot of outreach at the local level. The local government, the city of Norfolk in this case, should have done a much more robust job of scheduling and holding outreach events. But as I said in my presentation, because they were under the gun to get this done under a short time frame, under the 3x3x3 process, they truncated the outreach. They're now doing outreach on the back end, but because the project partnership agreement has been signed, as issues emerge doing the outreach now, if the non-federal partner, the city of Norfolk, tries to change the alignments, it's seen as a betterment, and it will cost the city of Norfolk to make those changes. And this is where we're caught right now, as neighborhood after neighborhood finally goes, oh, wait, you're building a flood wall down my street? I don't like that. Can you change it? So the local government should have been responsible.
I'm curious, Audrey, in Miami, knowing that study restarted at a certain point, what was the difference maybe you saw or experienced between community engagement and outreach between the first part of the study versus after it was reinitiated?
I think it was better. Yes, the Corps did hold charrettes, public webinars, in-person meetings, and they also put together a ArcGIS-powered web-based tool to solicit comments from people specific to where that person thought a project should go in that region. And I thought it was better of the Corps, but it's still not great, right? Because the Corps solicits public comments during certain NEPA waypoints, and those comments are incorporated for public record, and that's when the Corps has to respond point by point. I think they've done a better job of interfacing and engaging the community, but it's still, just because they're doing the community in-person outreach, it still doesn't mean that they have to fold those comments into the NEPA documents and respond to them. So to that end, what we've been pushing for is the Corps to put together working groups throughout the next phase of the project. And because NEPA is, again, only at certain points to bring into the community, we'd like to see the Corps shift to doing more than just NEPA and having folks, representatives from communities where, you know, a big project is going, speak on behalf of their communities throughout the duration of the project.
Thanks, Audrey. I'm curious, Robert, given that you're in a massive metro area, this mega study is, and I believe is one of the few studies I know of that actually has 3 local sponsors. So you have the pleasure of having probably much more capacity than a lot of these other regions have. What has that been like, you know, having the 2 states of New York, New Jersey, as well as the city being able to help with outreach? Have they done most of the outreach in the New York region? And has the Corps contributed to that?
Yeah, so they both New York, New Jersey states, I think, are technically the lead sponsors, but New York City is providing a lot of input, and New York City is particularly helpful because right now, as I mentioned in the presentation, they are potentially taking the lead on trying to find a solution to get the Environmental Justice Coordinating Committee going. So they are taking like a formal role there. Jackie, I don't know if you have any anything to add in terms of like the actual outreach itself?
Yeah, so the Army Corps has been doing its own outreach, and it has been problematic. Some of it I think was also, done online, or or in places and times that were really hard for people to show up at. And there wasn't as much thought to like translating things into different languages. We're a very multilingual city and region. So we were actively working with the Corps to try to improve some of their outreach. So yeah, we were looking to Miami and with some envy, and we were wondering, why is it that, some of those more participatory processes were possible in Miami, and they weren't really being translated to, the Army Corps here. So I think overall, our experience is that they need a lot more engagement, thoughtful engagement with communities, and they need to rethink how they do that really seriously. So yeah, Robert, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, and what that looks like is like formal roles that deal with engagement specifically, and like more funding for these strategies too, which is sometimes out of the district's control, is how much money they can spend to do all this, which really handicaps their ability to do it. Yeah, that's all I'll add.
I'd like to offer some thoughts on that. Oh, if you want to go ahead first.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. I'd also offer that I think it depends on the district leadership. For the Miami-Dade Back-Bay study, this is being handled by both Norfolk and Jacksonville districts. Jacksonville, which covers all of Florida, has been working on this massive Everglades restoration, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, or SERP. So this is, a $20 billion project that's been unfolding for the last couple of decades. And I think Jacksonville District just has more experience with engaging stakeholders, because our Everglades restoration does go near and sometimes through some urban areas, and certainly a lot of agricultural communities.
I was just going to add that one of the problems we run into is, once the feasibility study is approved, once the environmental assessment that is in the feasibility study is approved, the NEPA process for the project ends. And we have, subsequent to the approval of the feasibility study, attempted to have regular meetings with the Corps of Engineers, which they've refused, because they say that outside of NEPA, regular meetings with stakeholders constitutes a federal advisory committee, and that it would trigger the Federal Advisory Committee Act and a whole cumbersome set of regulations for us to have regular meetings with the Corps. So we have regular meetings with the city, who tells us what the Corps is doing. But this is why it's really critical that people in communities where these CSRMs are moving ahead get as much work done as they can under NEPA before the feasibility study is signed.
So I think, Skip, kind of piggybacking off of that answer, maybe you could talk a little bit about one of these questions goes into the 65-35 cost share between the federal and local sponsors. What happens if localities end up rejecting the plan that's proposed, and they reject levying any sort of taxes to fund the construction of these projects? Kind of what goes into that? Is there parts of the process that it makes more sense to try to reject a plan versus when do you get locked in?
Well, there's a couple of decision points that are critical. One is with the feasibility study, because in that study, the cost, the alignments, the different options, et cetera, are laid out. And if the locality disagrees, if the non-federal sponsor, the locality disagrees with all of those, whether it's the approach, the the scope or the cost, then the feasibility study is not approved and the project sort of goes back again, which is happening in a couple of the CSRM localities. But even if you move ahead, the next big decision point is that project partnership agreement. And it's at that point where you basically, as the non-federal, as the locality says, yeah, I agree to this project with this many gates and this many berms and this many this and that at this cost. And it's at that point, again, you can not sign the project partnership agreement or try to renegotiate it, although it's a little more difficult because the feasibility study has already been done. Once you sign the project partnership agreement, that's sort of uncharted territory. I noticed there was another question in there from Jim Morrison, who's been studying this quite extensively here. And there's been a lot of talk about what happens if we don't fund the next phase of this project. And either the project stops, or if the Corps decides it's in the national interest, they could move ahead on their own, although it would be very difficult to figure out how exactly that would be accomplished. But again, 2 decision points: feasibility study and the project partnership agreement, where the local government can say, nah, I don't agree to that. Let's go back and talk more.
Rachel, I'd like to add a couple comments. So the Galveston district is here, located on Galveston Island, and we have numerous projects along the Texas coast that the Corps is involved in. One of them is a dredge project in Lavaca Bay, which is a Superfund site for mercury, and it's being dredged for a potential export facility that would be built there. And in that particular project, they are engaging with the stakeholders, but it took a lawsuit to make that happen. And so we've had numerous demands for public meeting that met with the other stakeholders, the Port Association down there, and the individuals that want to construct the facility. So it's very difficult. There's a lot of projects up and down the Texas coast. We have begged in another project for 4 years for them to meet with us and never had a response. You see them in person at public meetings. Oh, sure, I'm getting your email. We'll engage. So it's so important for the public to be aware and stay on top of it and try to reach out and engage them as much as possible. The other component, when you talk about the non-federal sponsor, for this project that I presented in Texas, our state government created the Gulf Coast Protection District. And that would be basically the eminent domain and taxing authority for our project if it's ever built. And they have state funding, and they're currently stating that they might put $50 million into the design phase for the Corps. So in Texas, we've created the GLO is the current non-federal sponsor or partner for the planning, the design. But if the structure's built, they've created this Gulf Coast Protection District. And again, they're putting millions of dollars into the design phase of the project.
It's almost kind of like a little bit of a workaround. Interesting. Thank you. I think this is a great question for everyone. And I can think of a couple of you guys on this panel that can probably speak to this, at least for your particular study, or if not another study you're aware of. But are there examples where the Corps has been successful at advancing a project that builds on pre-existing local coastal resilience studies in your particular region? Like Audrey, I'm thinking, I know Miami has the sea level rise strategy and Resilient 305. Are those being used are those being considered by the Corps as they have moved through the process?
I know that the Corps is considering in its nature-based solutions pilot program, they are considering resilience or restoration projects that are already in the hopper. So I think it's a matter of the Corps continuing to work with the county on identifying those properties, usually public properties, where, say, a mangrove fringe already planned to be restored. But also making sure that the Corps really understands this multiple lines of defense strategy and not just having NNBFs kind of randomly strewed all over the place. So yes, this is subtropical South Florida with lots of biodiversity and therefore lots of protections and resilience plans. I want to say I'm optimistic that the Corps is working with the county on looking at what's already been done and capitalizing on those programs. You may have a little more information on that than I do, Rachel, but I haven't seen too much of it yet. But in the nature-based solutions pilot program, definitely the Corps is entertaining projects that are already being contemplated.
What about others? Virginia, New York, Galveston, are there local resilience strategies that are being considered by the Corps as they think through alternatives and design?
Well, the General Land Office has developed a Texas Coast plan that's taken several years to develop. And so there are, again, in that plan and in the coastal barrier plan for the entire Texas coast, there are some nourishment, there are some restoration projects. Unfortunately, for the upper Texas coast, the focus has been on these hard structures. In other area of the coast, they're doing beach nourishment, they're doing dune protection. So it just depends on the area and how it was analyzed by the GLO and the Corps in both plans.
Okay. This one seems to be directed maybe to Audrey or Robert. Are you optimistic that the achievements in advocating for non-structural plans, escaping standard economic frameworks, right, the NED, can that be translated elsewhere into the nation going forward?
Okay, if I go first, or how about you go first, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of advocating for escaping standard economic frameworks, that would be at the federal level. So that new rule that was proposed last February, which is yet to be implemented, that would apply to likely all future projects. It's unclear if that would apply to some of the current projects. I think Skip mentioned that some of the newer projects happening in Norfolk are using a similar process. But in terms of non-structural work, I think I can let Audrey speak to this as well, but I think assuming the work in Miami goes really well with the non-structural work, I think it can serve as an example for many other districts. But I can pass it off to Audrey.
I'd say that I'm very cautiously optimistic that it can be done. I'd mentioned that in January of 2021, the outgoing Assistant Secretary of the Army issued a memo to the Civil Works staff requiring the planners to incorporate a comprehensive evaluation of benefits, including not just economic, but social and environmental benefits. And that does represent a paradigm shift that I think is much better. The problem is, how do you implement it? So when we talk to Army Corps planning staff, they're great people, and they say, we really want to do this, but we don't know how, because the policy directive didn't issue any implementing measures. And oh, by the way, you calculate these environmental and social benefits at the regional level. So what our group has pushed for is for the Corps to work with local academia, work with local nonprofits who may have the skills to put together screening criteria and evaluation methods that get to evaluating those social and environmental benefits that are really localized. It's a matter of whether the Corps will, I think, seek expertise outside of its own shop. There is a retired Army Corps colonel that we work with. I don't know if he's on the call today, but Colonel Rock Salt, I'd like to quote him. He says that the Corps is not an artsy-fartsy organization. And what we're trying to ask the Corps to do is more cutting edge economics. So hoping that, the Corps staff, which is not a monolith, some really good people there, we can find the good folks that are, really interested in thinking outside the box and working with us on that.
And I'll do a small plug to say that EDF is very active in one of the largest non-structural studies in the nation, which is the Southwest Louisiana study. And so we're doing a social science exercise down there and hope to learn kind of the human dimension of non-structural home elevations and informing federal policy. So I think that will be very influential for folks like Miami and New York, New Jersey on kind of how they proceed with non-structural.
Let me just piggyback on what Audrey said. First of all, I was critical of the Corps in a lot of my presentations. I'm not critical of the Corps staff at our district as much as they're in a box. They're in a box. They're told to use the wrong, quote unquote, rates of sea level rise by headquarters. The Congress put them in a box by saying, just look at storm surge. And there are so many good people who work for the Corps. The issue of changing the ways these things are assessed, I think there are examples in other federal agencies, and I think that there are ways to look at them, even in the shoreline projects. The HUD's CDBG recovery and some of the other HUD programs which have funded projects here use a different form of analysis. There was one project here in Norfolk where when HUD looked at the project, they found and they included a lot of these environmental and social factors, they found a benefit cost ratio of 35-1. When the Corps looked at it, it was 5-1 when they were just looking at the economic benefits. So other federal agencies have started moving in this direction, and I think there are some paths to go down there as well.
Great, thanks, Skip. I think I'll do just one more if we can. I think this would be a good, quick, rapid fire from each of you. Bernadette has a really good question that I think is a great closer. Where do you all plan on focusing your energy the next 4 years? On the Corps or your local government? All of these fights are very local and contextual, and yet we're all facing what Audrey says is the big ship that takes time to turn around, which is very true. It's like turning the Titanic. So yeah, where do each of you, we'll start with you, Skip, if you want, where do you plan on focusing your energy for the next 4 years?
Well, I think a continuation of this bottom-up approach, sort of bringing it to the national level, is what's needed, because we each in our different projects or different localities or different cultures, our different core district cultures, bang our heads against these projects. And to the extent that we can bring the experiences that we've had at the street level up to a more generalized policy level, so that we can do policy briefs, so that folks like EDF can take this into the political process. I think that's a critical piece of it, informing the process by the experiences that we've had and continuing to do that.
Joni?
Thank you. I think for this current project we're fighting, we've had the most success going out to the public and raising awareness. So we will definitely continue to do that. And we have to work at all levels. We have to work local and state and federal. Our state government only meets every other year. And so, we're looking and strategizing who we will reach out to, what will we do in this coming session. And so it has to be at all level. But I still think that the focus needs to be on the people and ensuring that the people that will be impacted, the communities impacted by these projects, are well informed. And so we'll continue to doing our community as a surge forward group whenever needed to make sure that they're aware of the latest updates in the projects.
And Robert?
Yeah, so we're going to continue to work on hats and make sure that it gets started again, and then also becomes a truly community-led project. But we're also going to continue to have conversations like this and convene as part of our research at Columbia. So yeah, that's our plan going forward.
Audrey?
For Miami, we've had a lot of really good success in working with the county. The county, the folks live here, so they know the resources well. They're sympathetic to what people experience on a day-to-day basis. So I think we're going to keep up with our relationship with the county, and I think we're going to do much more public engagement, driving people into Corps meetings and asking the Corps to put together those community working groups to have representatives there throughout the process. So people don't just show up at those DEPA comment periods or public meetings and the Corps tends to issue things as lines and dots on a map. So if the Corps can do those community engagement groups and have somebody in the community that can translate all along the way what the Corps is thinking, that is something we'd really promote, is that connection of the Corps to the community.
Great. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Audrey, Joni, Robert, and Skip, as well as Jackie, for being our panelists and really diving deep into your regional studies and how that's relevant for all of us across the nation. And, you know, very important to continue to communicate this type of information to decision makers in DC, so that we can hopefully start seeing more of the outcomes that communities really want to support. Columbia was gracious to give me a quick couple minutes to do a really brief plug. You've heard EDF mentioned a couple of times in parallel with this group and in collaboration. We've been very engaged. EDF has been at shaping a lot of these coastal storm risk management studies that you've heard. I have counterparts in a number of states working with these folks who are local experts at really trying to act as that bridge between what's happening at the national level, bringing that information down to the local groups, and then vice versa, really trying to take up and elevate the voices that we're hearing on the ground to make sure that influences policy. And so over the next couple of years, at least as long as we've been funded, we have kind of 3 buckets of work that we have styled this Army Corps advocacy around, and that's advancing the state of the science toward more equitable, environmentally just, and nature-forward project selections and design. We want to build power by catalyzing and supporting local capacity to shape projects, and then reconfiguring federal systems and policies by advocating for sound, evidence-based, and community-informed policies and procedures, ensuring that core programs have the resources they need to be effective. So over the next year, you're probably going to start in collaboration with a lot of these folks. We hope to have a platform that we can point folks to with resources, fact sheets, FAQs, webinars, teach-ins, to be able to point those folks who may want to understand better if the Corps is in their backyard. What are some strategies and ways to get the outcomes you want to see, as well as what's happening at the federal level. And so we hope to continue that and influencing policy as we move forward and building on that role of us supporting that kind of bridge role that we've been playing. But this group, going forward, this partnership will continue to collaborate and convene around how to ensure that resilience planning and projects are truly community-led, address all kinds of flooding using natural and nature-based features, and centering frontline communities. It's important that these conversations continue as these issues affect everyone and will be increasingly more common. And we're excited, this group is excited to continue this conversation, and we invite you to join us. There will be a follow-up survey after this. We'll send out the contact information of folks. We'll have a recording of this webinar as well that's available, and we really encourage you all to, if you get a chance, to read the policy brief that I believe someone has put in the chat or will put again. It's really informative and shows kind of where we hope to turn the Titanic in the next few years. That is the Corps. And please reach out if you have any questions. And does anybody on the panel or Jackie have any final thoughts? Or I think we're good.
I just also want to thank you, Rachel, for a terrific job moderating. And yeah, let's keep this conversation going. It's an important one.
We appreciate you all coming. Really, really appreciate it. So be on the lookout for a follow-up email from us. So thank you all. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Hopefully you all get some time off.
Thank you.